tossing, turning, staying up all night long. Just want you by my side.
Chapter 17. Harry watched with a sort of exasperated patience as Death dramatically limped along behind him, a conjured crutch made out of some sort of twisted black wood supporting his injured side as he groaned and made frighteningly realistic sounds of agony and discontent. Redax and the goblin guard accompanying them down the hallway seemed entirely uncertain how to react to this, sending horrified stares at the wounded Death and awe-filled ones at Harry in equal measure. Harry was rather worried at this point that the goblins would declare him a master warrior of some kind and erect a golden statue in his honor due to his defeating of Death by kicking him in the shin. He just wished the entity would quit grasping spasmodically onto his arm for balance every third step or so, his rasping voice rising in pain until it eerily resembled the screams of a young woman being eviscerated. Harry's left eye hadn't stopped twitching since they'd left the main hall, and it didn't look like it was likely to stop anytime soon. The armed guard following them flinched every time Death wailed, and once it had even made an aborted motion to shove its pike in Death's general direction before Redax had barked something at him in gobbledygook that had the guard paling to an unattractive, milky green, and resuming his walk stiffly and emotionlessly. Harry would have pitied the goblins a bit more if he wasn't finding this so very hilarious. Redax eventually stopped before a large ornate door, large, considering this was the office of a goblin who couldn't be more than 3 feet tall, and yet the door was over 10, with a simple gold plate declaring Liver Crusher in neat, professional font. Redax knocked twice before pushing the door open without waiting for any sort of audible response, and then he paused. He seemed rather conflicted over whether to insist Harry, and his leech-like guest, walk in first as was courteous and proper and risk Death brushing so very close to him, or walk in first impolitely and have Death at his back. The goblin settled on a strange sort of hover, where he had one hand pressed to the door, but stepped inside the room and held the heavy door open with the tips of his long, spindly fingers. Harry doubted he'd be able to keep the door open like that for long, and quickly hurried inside, dragging Death along with him as the entity was now bracing most of his weight on Harry's shoulder as he moaned in his apparent agony. The goblin behind the desk was identical to just about every other goblin Harry had ever seen. He tried to be polite and remember names and faces, but he was pretty sure the goblins were all secretly clones of each other and laughed at wizards trying to tell them apart behind their backs, except for a very small, neatly trimmed triangular beard on his chin that was at odds with the rest of his surly face. Harry stared at that beard for lack of anything else to do, wondering if the goblin spent time actually trimming it into that perfect of a triangle, or if goblin beards were naturally predisposed to geometric shapes. Death made a sort of rasping chuckle-cough noise at that thought, and Harry elbowed him without looking. Death wheezed and collapsed to the ground, clutching his middle in exaggerated misery. Harry was tempted to kick the entity while he was down, but he'd already almost given the 3 goblins heart attacks just by elbowing him. Who knew how they'd react should he actually assault the aggravating immortal? Shush, Harry shushed him, giving Death a look. Could you at least try and act your age? Death stopped rolling around on the floor and glanced up through one void black eye, promptly dissolving into bone-colored dust on the floor. Harry's palm met his face with a satisfying thwack, and the muffled sound of the goblin guard by the door fainting echoed him. That is not what I meant, Harry grumbled, running his hand through his hair and turning his attention back to Liver Crusher, pointedly ignoring the pile of dust on the ground by his feet. Well then, he began briskly, not even blinking when he felt an arm sling itself around his shoulders and the immortal form of Death appeared beside him. He flicked a glance down and saw that, yes, the dust pile was still there, but ignored it. Redax mentioned that you were the Potter account manager. Liver Crusher opened his mouth to reply, but all that emerged was a distinctly mouse-like squeak. Motion paused. All eyes turned to the goblin behind the desk, including the slightly reproving and mortified gaze of Redax, as Liver Crusher's green skin tinted purple. The goblin cleared his throat a few times meaningfully before he tried again. Yes, Mr. Potter. The previous Potter account manager, Bone Club, was found to have been implicated in several accounts of thievery from your main vault. He was summarily executed and fed to the dragons guarding the lower vaults. Pity, Death mused, the 2 conscious goblins stiffening at his voice the first time they'd heard it without it being disguised by a human throat. I would have enjoyed showing the thief why stealing from my shell is a monumentally foolish idea. Death heaved a sigh, face stretched into a shark-like grin. I suppose I shall simply be content to pull his festering soul out of the beyond to show him such once our business has been concluded. Harry, with the ease of practice, pretended he had heard nothing, visibly disturbing the goblins in the process. Thievery, he prodded, a suspicion forming in his mind. As to the culprit, but he'd rather have solid evidence before he worked himself up about it. Livercrusher recovered admirably, shuffling some papers, actual papers, at that, and not parchments, seemed the goblins kept more up-to-date than the rest of the wizarding world, on his desk as he spoke. Yes. Chief Mugwump Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore made 10 unauthorized transactions from the years 1981 to 1991, a lump sum of 15,000 galleons to be withdrawn once per year on seemingly random days. He also removed an artifact from the Potter Vault, one cloak of invisibility. Harry noticed Death's full body twitch and reminded himself to ask the entity about that later, along with a small strongbox put there by the late Lord Potter that was to be given to you upon your 11th birthday. Livercrusher paused as the room briefly grew uncomfortably warm as Harry's anger manifested itself. When the wizard had a hold of himself, the goblin continued. Further attempts to withdraw the usual 15,000 galleons were denied, as the confirmation of heirship documents which were sent to you upon your acceptance into Hogwarts were never filled out correctly. They were returned signed, but the magical signature included did not hold up to the standard consent tests performed on such documents. It was determined that the documents were either forged or signed under the presence of a compulsion charm, which invalidated the document and put your vaults on lockdown. It was, ironically, this lockdown that allowed us to audit your account and find the theft in the first place. Here the goblin grinned toothily, as if inviting Harry to share in their amusement of the irony. Harry did not reply, too busy trying to hold in his magic from doing something destructive as his anger warred with his common sense. He'd suspected something like this as soon as the goblin mentioned thievery, but having it confirmed aloud made it more real somehow. He was torn between the desire to start breaking things, march straight to headquarters to punch Dumbledore in the nose, or generally just rage about the injustice of it all. The indecision locked him in place, which likely saved the goblin's office from being forcibly redecorated. You will, of course, be returning to my shell the funds which were so appallingly stolen from him, Death said into the silence, voice flat and unusually serious considering how amused he normally sounded. This was not a question, or even a suggestion, but rather a statement of fact. The goblins would be returning the money, or Death would do so for them in the most destructive and lethal manner he could think of. That this manner would likely include the genocidal eradication of the entire goblin nation went unsaid, but was implicitly understood. Why yes, of course, Livercrusher stammered, shuffling his papers again, this time nervously. We shall take the funds directly from the Chief Mugwump's vault in recompense. With interest, I assume. Oh why yes, Livercrusher nodded so fast his neck popped, reminding Harry dimly of Dobby. Interest. Of course. Death's fingers tightened on Harry's shoulder, a sliver of his icy magic reaching out and smothering the fire anger of Harry's own like a particularly cold blanket. The effect was not unlike having a bucket of ice water dumped over one's head, and Harry shivered as his breath frosted the air in front of him for several heartbeats afterwards. He did feel a great deal calmer now, though. He felt more in control of his magic, rather than it being the other way around. And what of the strongbox? Harry asked once his teeth stopped chattering. He wanted everything that had been stolen back, and he wanted it back immediately. There was no way he was leaving anything that belonged to his father in Dumbledore's greedy hands. That, unfortunately, is something we are unable to recall physically. It seems to be behind a particularly impressive set of ancient wards. We suspect the Chief Mugwump has it stored within Hogwarts, as the castle is notorious for being impervious to traditional curse-breaking. Livercrusher grimaced, seeming genuinely apologetic either despite or because of the looming figure of Death with its arms still around Harry's shoulders. Death scoffed, his gaunt face entirely unimpressed. Foolish mortal. There is no ward that has ever existed or that shall ever exist capable of stopping Death. He reached out his free hand and the air around it abruptly bucked, the space above Death's outstretched palm warping and convulsing in an eye-bending example of how the laws of space and time meant nothing to Death. Within moments a gold box about 15 inches long landed in his hand, the edges smoking. and blurring as it tried to reconfigure itself into something capable of existing in this plane of reality after having just been forcibly pulled across the intervening distance through nothing but will alone. Once the box stopped shuddering and seemed mostly solid, Death turned and dropped it into Harry's hands with a satisfied grin. Harry, ignoring the dumbfounded and terrified goblins, clutched the box to his chest with both arms, hunching over it protectively. This box had belonged to his father. This box had been meant for him. It was an actual gift from his parents, the only one he'd ever gotten that wasn't second-hand. Sure, his cloak had also belonged to his dad, but that had been something Dumbledore had purloined and given to him in the guise of a Christmas present. This was something that his father had explicitly stated was to go to Harry, and that hadn't already been pawed over or looked at by anyone else. He wasn't letting go of this box even if the world were to suddenly erupt into Armageddon. Death's hand squeezed his shoulder again, before the entity turned sharp, unforgivable eyes on the frightened goblin behind the desk. My shell requires privacy in which to view the contents of his father's strongbox. Oh, why yes of course, if you'll just follow no. This room will suffice. You will vacate the premises and not return until I fetch you. Livercrusher dithered, torn between arguing that his was his office and therefore he had every right to remain in it, or immediately capitulating since this was death and Livercrusher very much did not want to die. A bit of his goblin pride pushed through the overwhelming, animal-like terror that had gripped him since the being had first stepped foot in the bank. My apologies, but this is my office. There are other private rooms I can arrange leave. Livercrusher bolted, tripping over his own feet as he barreled into the petrified form of Redax still in the doorway. The two goblins clawed at the ground and at each other as they alternatively dragged and shoved each other out of the room, one of them reaching in with a clawed hand and pulling the unconscious guard out after them by the foot before the door slammed shut and locked itself. Harry found it in himself to laugh under his breath at how the goblins reacted to his friend, not finding it at all odd that Death had just kicked a goblin out of his own office just so he could look through the contents of a box. He found himself surprisingly eager to see what his father had left for him as he set the strongbox on Livercrusher's desk, searching for a lock or a latch with which to open it. He was startled to find the box was one seamless block of metal, with no apparent way to open it. With a furrowed brow, Harry lifted the box and shook it next to his ear, hearing the unmistakable sound of things rattling around. So it was definitely hollow, then. Harry recalled the Marauder's map and wondered if this box functioned similarly, reaching into his pocket for his wand. He pressed the tip of his wand to what he figured was the top of the box, due to the large crest of a stag with lilies in its antlers, and repeated the phrase he'd heard that the Marauders used when they were in Hogwarts. I solemnly swear that I am up to no good. The box clicked open incongruously, the seam appearing as if it had always been there despite evidence to the contrary. Eagerly, Harry opened the box and stared. Inside were two folded letters, one written on wizarding parchment and one on lined muggle paper. There were also a dozen or so vials with a strange silvery substance in them, along with a few envelopes that presumably had letters in them. Each envelope had a name on them, so Harry figured he had been meant to receive and deliver those back when he was in his first year. He lifted out one of the vials and stared at it. It didn't look like a potion. It looked more like a piece of silver, liquefied cloth as it twirled around itself endlessly. He wondered what it was, and why there were so many of them. Those are memories, my shell, Death murmured in his ear. They require the use of a pensieve to view properly. Harry's fingers went numb as he gingerly set the vial, his parents' memory, back into the box as if it would break should he breathe on it too hard. This was beyond anything he had been expecting. The contents of this box were priceless. He could have had memories of his parents since he was 11, and yet Dumbledore had taken this from his vault and never even let on that it existed. The air grew steadily warmer as his magic reflected his rising ire, and this time Death did not bother extinguishing his anger. Instead, the being stoked it. Perhaps the fate I had envisioned for your headmaster was far too kind. Death spoke beguilingly into the silence. His voice was low and smooth, lacking the traditional rasp. Tisk. Where does the mortal's deceit end? The question was obviously rhetorical, for Death had taken to circling Harry's still form, close enough that his robes brushed Harry's arms occasionally. Would you like me to exact revenge for you, my shell? Death whispered, voice urgent and gleeful now. Would you like me to rip out his soul? His magic? I can do that. You know, I can tear his magic from him, piece by piece, and play his screams for you like a serenade. I can rip from him his pride, his arrogance, his foolish greed, and leave him a quivering wreck of blood and flesh. Death came to rest in between Harry and the desk where the open box lay, setting both hands on Harry's shoulders, absinthe eyes wide and eager as a maniac. Fanged grin cracked his face in half. Just say the word, my shall. Say the word and I shall show this mortal worm that there shall be no mercy for him in death. Harry stood quietly, staring into the expectant eyes of death, and realized something quietly terrifying. This ancient entity, this all-powerful creature, was waiting for orders. Orders from him, Harry Potter, a 16-year-old wizard. That kind of power could be intoxicating, Harry knew, and he would grow addicted to it if he wasn't careful. Taking a careful breath, Harry tried to shelve his anger and think this through rationally. He bit back the instinctive yes, go teach the bastard a lesson and attempted to puzzle through the consequences of such an action. He wouldn't feel regret were he to sick death on Dumbledore, certainly. He might even feel rather good about it. The man had all but made his life a living hell since he was practically an infant, and Harry had a grudge the size of Russia about the whole Dursley situation. Dumbledore was a powerful person politically, but Death didn't care for politics, and if Harry brought it up, the entity would likely just laugh at the mere idea that mortal politics meant anything at all to him. At this point it was mostly just his morals holding him back. If he let Death at Dumbledore, as if he had the power to stop him, would that make him evil? It would be justice, wouldn't it? Righteous vengeance? Would he leave it at that, though, or turn against others who had wronged him? Would he ever stop? Would he want to? Would he be able to stop, or would he eventually become something worse than Voldemort? Death wouldn't care either way. Harry could ask him to enslave the earth, and Harry figured Death would do so without batting an eyelash. Death didn't care for anyone else in the world other than Harry. In fact, Harry was rather sure Death held the entire human population in complete disdain. Somehow, the idea that Death wouldn't ever leave him no matter his choices was vastly comforting. With Ron and Hermione, there was always this underlying understanding that if he ever went dark they would likely not stand with him. Their views were so radically black and white that they would never be able to really understand if he did something they didn't see as light. He just knew that neither of them would understand his need for revenge against Dumbledore or the Dursleys. Hermione knew the basics about his life at Privet Drive, but even then she always simply suggested he go to Dumbledore or tell some other adult about it and let them handle it. Harry didn't really trust adults, and thus trusted this advice even less. Ron knew more about the Dursleys than Hermione, having seen the bars on his window in his second year, but as a sixth son with a loving family he couldn't really grasp the concept of abuse with any sort of accuracy. Harry desperately wanted to remain friends with Ron and Hermione, but he also desperately wanted Dumbledore to pay out the nose for what he'd done to him over the years. Maybe these didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Maybe he could get his revenge, and just not let his friends know about it? Surely Death could do something discreet enough that no one would trace it back to Harry himself? Harry would know the truth, and he'd be sure Dumbledore knew it before he died, but did anyone else really have to be aware? Death, Harry spoke before he lost his nerve, feeling the sharpening of the entity's attention as it sensed/heard/felt his decision. How good are you at being subtle? I am Death, my shell. I am intangible, invisible, inevitable. I am the biting chill of the final winter, the shadow you thought you saw, and the end of all things. I am the very definition of subtlety. Harry smiled, grimly satisfied. Then maybe it's time that someone showed Dumbledore that he is not entitled to play God. Death's grin cracked a few centimeters wider. That's the end of this chapter. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe for more and to help this channel grow. See you next time.
You got some